This week on the only Star Trek review show that matters, we ask the question, what makes a great sitcom? And we review, by way of illustration, what doesn't, the latest episode of Star Trek Lower Decks. Welcome to Critic's Log. Space. A continuous extension interval between planets, stars, and other objects. These are the critiques of the critic McElvoy. His continuing mission to review strange new shows, to seek out new work and new bastardizations, to boldly note what no critic has noted before. Friends, degenerates, anthropoids, welcome to another edition of Critic's Log. This week we will be reviewing episode 3 of season 5, The Best Exotic Nanite Hotel. References. Who will buy my lovely sweet references? Not me, but we'll come back to that momentarily. But before that, we're just going to briefly discuss, and I do mean briefly, I won't keep you too long, so just be patient. What makes a great situation comedy? Because if we're suggesting, as we are, and by we I mean me, that Lower Decks is not a good situation comedy, that it is witless and wholly reliant on references to pre-existing Star Trek franchise material, to create, if you like, comic polarities, if you will, by acting off the reservation, by not adhering to the self-seriousness of the Star Trek universe. It mines its comedy from that, It's equivalent of a group of teenagers being let loose on the Star Trek set. That's the joke. If we say that isn't funny, and it's not, then we have to ask the question, what is funny? And what does work? What shows can we talk about that illustrate how it could have been done? If somebody years ago had come to me and said, Ed, I want you to create a Star Trek situation comedy, of course, I would have laughed, because the very notion is silly, and I would have told them to fuck off, and then they'd have handed me a really, juicy check, and I would have reconsidered all of my principles, all of my values, and said, all right, I can do this. All I've got to do is do what comes to me naturally, which is be stupid and tell terrible jokes. I can do that, particularly for $1 million. It's not big and it's not clever. Anyone can do it. You can do it. And if you're Mike McMahon and you're watching this, you have done it. But, as Jeff Goldblum once said in Jurassic Park's, just because you can do something doesn't mean you should. He didn't say that. I'm paraphrasing, but what's that effect? So, if I'm charged with making a Star Trek situation comedy, what do I have to think about? My primary duty is to protect the franchise, the integrity of the franchise. I cannot write a show that undermines it. That is to say, just turns it into a sausage factory for reference material, which I can then use to create sort of facsimiles of jokes. That's the lazy approach. That's the teenage playground approach. That's Mike McMahon's approach. Instead, I have to find a way to create comedic situations with characters that are rooted in the pre-established universe. Not an easy task. You know, every other sitcom ever created has got absolute freedom to be whatever it wants to be. But there are models that we can turn to that tell us how it might be done. Now, I'm going to start with a really obvious one. One that I'm sure you've all thought about when you think about situation comedy and sci-fi and all the rest of it. And that's the British television sitcom, yes, you've guessed it, One Foot in the Grave. I was going to say Red Dwarf, didn't you? Don't be so presumptuous. Yeah, of course we're going to talk about Red Dwarf momentarily. One Foot in the Grave, some of you won't be familiar with it. In the United States, it was remade as Cosby, one of the many Cosby shows, with serial rapist Bill Cosby in the lead role, hence Cosby. But the more imaginative and less perverse and problematic UK version is called One Foot in the Grave. It's written by David Renwick, who also wrote Jonathan Creek. And David Renwick is a very funny man, very inventive comic writer. It's got a taste for black comedy, a great flair for visual gags, and above all, for rooting his stories in something like the real world. That is to say, he can create situations that allow for a little bit of pathos. Because Victor Meldrew and his wife, Margaret, who are two pensioners, Victor extremely curmudgeonly and someone to whom awful and surreal things happen. Sometimes by way of him taking people on, sometimes just through pure bad luck. Through this vehicle, Renwick, takes your sort of standard suburban sitcom and turns it into this kind of phantasmagoria full of surrealist jokes and absurd situations and, wonderful comedies of error and misunderstanding.
Good morning, Mr. Mildred. You well? I just set him down here.
Right. Oh, hang on. I think I left the back door open, just in case he makes a boat for it.
There we are.
Tell me this is just a joke.
Sorry, Mr. Meldrew.
What the bloody hell's this?
It's Mr. Burkitt's dog, Nippy.
Nippy? Doesn't look very nippy from where I'm standing.
It's wonderful. Oh, and spoilers, it's a show that ends with the lead character being killed in a hit and run. Yeah, that's right. It's full of scenes in which characters have the space to be serious for a moment and say or do something that gets you emotionally, makes you think about life, makes you reflect, moments of pathos. Renwick understands the line between comedy and tragedy, and he's always walking that tightrope beautifully in that show. Now, why am I talking about this show? I'm talking about it because it illustrates how a sitcom can have a degree of realism in the sense that the characters aren't just constructs designed to tell jokes. They're not just devices for zany situationism. They are also well-rounded, three-dimensional human beings to whom ridiculous comic things occur. That's a pretty good approach for a sitcom, wouldn't you say? You could take Victor and Margaret and One Foot in the Grave and you could put them in a drama. And with a little adjustment, they would fit right in. Now that's why I suggest that this is not a bad model for a Star Trek situation comedy. You simply have to create a scenario where characters who could exist in other Star Trek shows like Voyager, TNG, DS9, Enterprise, etc., the original series, come up against a series of oddball and surrealist situations which create a certain amount of humour. Yes? You know, anything can be funny if it's viewed through a certain prism. You know, there are lots of lovely little vignettes in One Foot in the Grave, like, you know, Victor waiting for a Chinese takeaway and the owners of the restaurant all gathered at the front counter looking at a portion of rice that has been brought back by a customer. And there's something alive in there, and they've put a cage over it, and they're poking it through the holes in the cage. You know? And the comedy situation there, of course, is that obviously this is a Chinese restaurant with a very, very serious hygiene problem. And then Victor, of course, is called upon to take up his meal, and he does so with a bit, having witnessed this spectacle with, you know, a lot of apprehension and so on and so on. That's comedy. Doesn't have to say anything stupid, doesn't have to talk like a fucking moron. It's a lovely bit of situation comedy. And pound for pound, One Foot in the Grave has more jokes like that than probably any other sitcom. It has some wonderfully surrealist moments, you know, which I won't give you the context because I want you to go away and watch it. But, you know, a Citroen 2CV in a skip. Somebody machine gunning a garden full of garden gnomes. You know, it's got lots of extraordinary stuff in it. Very funny stuff. Because there's an intelligence to the writing. You know, how can these extraordinary, silly things happen to an ordinary man? And that's the grounding that's so important. That's what Lower Decks lacks, of course, any kind of grounding. They went the other way. They said all the characters are all going to be really, whoa, zany, whoa. Lower decks, we're gonna talk like fucking idiots. That's not funny. That's a humour killer. and it's completely and totally, tonally out of step with the parent franchise, it's fine as a sort of disconnected parody, but not as a branded show in the franchise. Because then you're asking us to believe that the franchise we know and love and this thing exist in the same universe. And that just doesn't sort of work. I mean, you know, in real life, I suppose it's true that there are pockets of society that are professional and serious, and other places where everyone you encounter is retarded. But you can't transplant the retarded people to the professional setting, because then it poses questions about why are they there? How did they get there? So, okay, we'll mention one for the go. Let's talk about, briefly, Red Dwarf. Now you might say, well, Red Dwarf, isn't that sort of zany and absurdist and all the rest of it? Situations are absurd. Absolutely. But the characters? Not really. The characters have a little bit of integrity, don't they? We all know a Rimmer, sort of an officious, self-important arsehole promoted beyond his abilities. If you've never worked with somebody like that, you've been very lucky. Because I certainly have. Lister is a sort of blue-collar, lazy, grunt type, blokish person who, outside of work, has no intellectual interest and likes to go for lager and vindaloo, etc., etc. He's an everyman. But there's no suggestion that these people are stupid. We accept, don't we, from the very beginning of Red Dwarf, that they at least can do their jobs, that they are competent enough to be in the Space Corps. And when they were in their original setup as officers on Red Dwarf, they performed their duties reasonably well. They're not stellar, not outstanding people. They're just, just ordinary crew. But because, of Lister going into stasis and waking up 3 million years in the future and being the only human left alive, obviously that changes everything. And they adapt. But when they're going to other planets, or if they're on Starbug or whatever, we accept that they know what they're doing. And a lot of the humour comes from, the rich sort of comic inventiveness of the setups, like going to a planet where an Earth where everything is going backwards and so on. I think you've just uneaten his pie. You remember that? Crichton isn't an idiot. He's a mechanoid, and he comically undercuts each scenario.
May I remind you of Space Corps Directive 34124?
34124. No officer with false teeth should attempt oral sex in zero gravity.
So, I mention this because these are characters we can believe in. who can still go through a series of very silly comic situations, but still exist in a universe which is plausibly a science fiction universe, right? Do you agree? Now you have to compare and contrast that to Star Trek Lower Decks.
Don't give me the Star Trek crap. It's too early in the morning.
We know from decades of Star Trek that characters in the 24th century have a certain formality. They speak with an auxiliary form of English that everybody understands, that they are not subject to modern, idioms and idiosyncrasies, and they are not self-aware. That is to say, they are not conscious that they are in a thing called Star Trek. They haven't seen 178 episodes of Star Trek The Next Generation. The people on DS9 have only got a sort of distant understanding of what's gone on the Enterprise. They don't know it like you and I know it. That's the difference. That's what gives it a universe its credibility. Lower Decks, all the characters know everything we know. And by God, are they keen to let us know it. And that, of course, makes the universe smaller. It shrinks that universe. And just turns it into what? An in-joke. And I want Star Trek, not a fucking in-joke. With that in mind, let's talk about episode 3, The Best Exotic Nanite Hotel. The Best Exotic Nanite Hotel was 22 minutes of nothing. Oh, you want a bit more, do you? All right. Okay. Well, let's dissect what it was about. So the Lower Decks crew went to a sort of hotel-like place, like a theme park world, where some nanites had gone rogue and were doing a thing, forming a cluster or whatever. Mariner's plot was that she was stuck with Jennifer the Andorian. Why would an Andorian be called Jennifer, you might well ask? Because it's supposed to be funny, isn't it? It's like calling a Klingon Keith. Except they still think they're a couple. You may remember, I sure didn't, that Mariner had a relationship with a girl, an Andorian called Jennifer, in a previous season. But apparently she didn't get the memo, because she still thinks they're together. So they have to beam down, and then, of course, spend the entire episode exploring that tension, just as two professional Starfleet officers wouldn't. Meanwhile, in another part of the same mission, Boimler, remember him? Nope, me neither. Is stuck with Ransom, remember him? Nope, me neither. And the joke there is that he thinks he's being used as sort of canary in the mine to do dangerous things that other officers don't want to do, because a previous guy on one of Ransom's missions has lost both his hands. In the end, Boimler saves the day, saves Ransom from some admiral that they're after. It's sort of a very weak spoof of Apocalypse Now. So it felt like an apocalypse to me. And it turns out that Jennifer the Andorian knew that her Mariner had split up all along, but was, in her own words, fucking with her. Because Mariner hadn't had the guts to formally split them up. Just sort of ignored her for a year. That was it. Is that worth 22 minutes of Star Trek? In the midst of all of this, references. Who will buy my lovely sweet references? So, straight off the bat, you had Boimler referring to Dixon Hill slot machines. You remember Dixon Hill? It was the PI, sort of Chandler-esque PI that Captain Picard liked and recreated in the holodeck. Now, why would the sort of niche literary taste of Captain Picard have become a sort of franchisable IP in the 24th century when such things, such sort of spin-off merchandise presumably no longer exists? Why would there be a company in the 24th century that made slot machines based on 24th century intellectual property? Can you answer that? Not in the Star Trek universe I knew and loved, but apparently in this version of it, it happens. Dixon Hill slot machines. Now, of course, this is a throwaway gag. We're not supposed to think about it. But that's the problem with Lower Decks, right? It's designed for people who don't think, written by people who don't think. If you think about it for any longer than 5 seconds, as I'm obliged to do for your cheap entertainment, then it falls apart, doesn't it? For example, later in the same episode, Boimler says, when referring to space whales, maybe it's a galaxy's child thing. Which is a direct reference, of course, to the season 4 TNG episode Galaxy's Child, in which a creature was born in space. I don't think it was a whale. That it, attached itself to the Enterprise and suckled on its power. Do you remember that? Somebody surely does. The writers of Lower Decks do. Now, they've tried to sort of make it a general reference. Oh, it's a Galaxy's Child type thing. But of course, it's part of that sort of self-aware humour that permeates Lower Decks. It's like Boimler saying, all these time travel shenanigans is a real all good things type scenario. The timeline's changed. That's just so yesterday's Enterprise. No. God Almighty, don't you see how this ruins Star Trek by making the critical mistake of replacing the audience, the knowledge the character should have with the knowledge the audience has. It flatters a stupid audience. They laugh and go, Galaxy's Child thing, I recognise that. I know what that is. And that's what this show is supposed to be about, really. It's just sort of a lot of fandom masturbation. But it can't be a Star Trek series in its own right if it does that. Because a Star Trek show that knows that other Star Trek shows exist, even tacitly, cannot be a real Star Trek series. As usual, there's a lot of what Tallinn called trash talk in this episode. We're like a couple of chatty chattersons. I'm not your bro. Things no 24th century human character should be saying. Lots of bleeped out swearing as per usual. Why would any Andorian use the expression, I was fucking with you? Now, there are going to be some of you who will say, well, what does it matter? I mean, you know, it's just having a bit of fun in the Star Trek universe. No, it's not. It's intruding on the Star Trek universe. It's using the Star Trek universe as a prop. So a group of unimaginative writers who can't write real Star Trek characters can write the types of characters they do know and do understand. In other words, people like themselves. Idiots! Oh, fuck, and there was even a reference to Star Trek Voyager. Inside the nanite little thing, they found another Intrepid-class starship that had got lost. Do they all get lost? That's a joke now. Undermines Voyager completely by turning everything that happened to the Voyager into just sort of the setup for a joke. But okay. The poverty of ambition here is what strikes you. It's all so interminably boring and easy. I could write this crap in an afternoon. You could write it in an afternoon. How many drafts of that script were produced? And doesn't it amaze you when you think about it that they used to produce 26 episodes of real Star Trek every year under an incredibly tight schedule and still managed to create so many classic episodes, so many wonderful moments, so many memorable characters, so many terrific pieces of dialogue. And these morons who make Lower Decks have got all the time they want, all the time in the world, no doubt, and are only writing 22-minute episodes, and all they can come up with is junk. Junk that if you take away the material that it points to, the better material that it references, you have nothing left. Nothing. And on that note, let's do anomalous readings. Just one anomalous reading this week, and that is this. That this episode had nothing in it that expanded Star Trek lore in any way or tried to do so. In other words, it was a disposable episode, a throwaway episode, a filler episode in a 10-episode season. And as such, can be dismissed and forgotten. So, sorry, what were we talking about?